Welcome to the second segment of a three-part series where I look into coffee roasting at home. In this segment, I'll be talking about the basics of coffee roasting. There are a couple of things that you need to worry about before roasting your first batch of coffee. The first one is where to get your green coffee beans, because you won't be able to go to your local roastery and get green coffee beans. The easiest place to find it is online. So if you live in the US, Sweet Maria's is great. If you live in Canada, Buy Coffee Canada is great. And if you live anywhere else, I would just recommend Googling green coffee beans online and find a place that sells it in bulk. Compared to roasted coffee beans, green coffee beans last for around a year or so. If this is your first time roasting coffee beans, I would highly recommend getting a bean that is a bit more suitable for a darker roast, like a Colombian or a Brazilian, because they're a bit more forgiving for beginner roasters. Before you start roasting, I would also recommend having a plan. And a plan means that you know exactly what roast level you're going to remove the beans from the roaster at. So Google what most people roast that type of green bean to and aim for something similar to that. Here are a couple of concepts that you need to be wary of when you're roasting your first batch of beans. There is something called the first crack, which is when a bean goes from the green bean state to a light roast. And what happens here is that the heat that is being applied to the bean removes a lot of the moisture and causes the beans to expand and then create this crack that is similar to a popcorn kernel popping. There's also something called the second crack, which is the indication when a bean goes from a medium roast to a dark roast. Now, the one thing to be wary of here is that when a bean reaches the dark roast territory, its roast level changes extremely quickly. By applying the proper amount of heat to your coffee beans, they'll start browning. And this is actually called the Maillard reaction, when the amino acids and sugars create a complex reaction. And this reaction then creates melanoidins, which then lead to a lot of the interesting flavors we want from coffee. After you've roasted your coffee, you should be waiting around 2 days before brewing with them. And this is because the beans are packed with CO2. And if you brew with one of those beans that are too fresh, what will happen is that CO2 will hamper the extraction. Here are a couple of roast level defects that you should be on the lookout for when you're drinking your coffee. The first defect to be on the lookout for is a underdeveloped roast. This is when you haven't roasted your coffee bean for a long enough time. And what happens is that you haven't given the bean enough time to develop those interesting, delicious tastes. Some characteristics of this roast defect is that the bean is extremely dense. So if you try grinding it and it's way harder than normal, this might be an indication of an underdeveloped bean. It will also be very flat in taste. The second thing to be on the lookout for is a baked bean. Now, a baked bean occurs when you don't have enough heat in your coffee roasting setup. So if you roast a bean at a low temperature for a long time, it will become baked. And what happens is that the outside will look nice and brown, but the insides haven't gotten a chance to develop those interesting and complex flavors. The third defect to be on the lookout for is over roasting. And this occurs when you are trying to get a really dark roast of a coffee, but you go a bit too far and all of the roast level tastes just overshadow the coffee bean itself. The fourth defect that I would be on the lookout for is a scorched bean. And this is when you've applied too much heat on one side of the bean, leading to an uneven roast on the bean. This is extremely easy to do with a direct heat method like a cast iron, but it can also occur with a hot air method like the popcorn popper and the heat gun if you don't have enough movement in the beans when you're roasting. If you have any questions about the basics of coffee roasting, then feel free to comment down below. If you want to learn more about coffee roasting at home, then I'll pass you along to part 3, budget coffee roasting setups for under $100, or you should totally check out part 1, which talks about if you should be even getting into coffee roasting in the first place. I'll see you there.